Nyasaland, Africa, 1915. As the British flag cast its shadow across the colony, a black pastor stood inside a small chapel and whispered, "God did not create slaves." His name was John Chilembwe, the man who dared to ignite freedom within an empire. At the dawn of the 20th century, the land now called Malawi was known by another name, Nyasaland, a colony carved and claimed by the British Empire. To London, it was just another piece of the grand imperial map, a territory of civilization and Christianity. But to the millions who lived there, it was a cage built from taxes, sweat, and pain. The British had promised order and salvation. What they delivered were plantations and punishments. Vast estates stretched across the fertile lands, owned by white settlers who called themselves bringers of progress. African men were forced to grow cotton under a sun that burned like iron. Women carried water for miles, bending their backs beneath the weight of imperial ambition. Children learned to fear the whip before they ever learned to read. They called it hut tax, a cruel levy that demanded payment for living on one's own land. When men could not pay, they were seized and sent to labor camps. The road that connected Blantyre to Zomba was built on bleeding feet. The word justice was spoken in English, but never practiced in it. And yet, amid this silence, one figure began to rise, not a soldier, not a politician, but a pastor. His name was John Chilembwe. He was quiet, deliberate, and dignified, often seen walking the dusty roads between villages with a Bible pressed against his chest. But inside that book, and within his heart, burned a vision that frightened the empire, a belief that faith without freedom is blasphemy. While others bowed their heads, Chilembwe looked up. While others prayed for mercy, he prayed for courage. He knew that God could not bless a world where men were chained for profit. And in that conviction, beneath the shadow of colonial banners, a seed of rebellion began to grow, not from anger alone, but from dignity long denied. The empire had conquered Nyasaland with guns and gold, but Chilembwe would fight it with words and will. John Chilembwe was born in 1871, the son of a farmer and a faithful believer. His early life was marked by hardship, the endless demands of colonial overseers, and the silent humiliation of being considered lesser in the land of his birth. But fate, or perhaps providence, had other plans for him. In his youth, he met American Baptist missionaries who saw in him something rare, a sharp mind and a restless spirit. They sent him across the ocean to Virginia, where he studied theology. There, in the heart of America, he discovered not only the teachings of the gospel, but the language of liberty. He saw the scars of slavery in the American South, heard the hymns of freed men who sang about redemption through resistance, and understood that faith could be a weapon not of violence, but of truth. In Virginia, he learned that salvation without justice is hollow, and that education is the first breath of freedom. When he returned to Nyasaland, he was no longer a student, he was a messenger. He founded the Providence Industrial Mission, a church and school that became a sanctuary for the oppressed. There, he preached a dangerous gospel, one that told his people they were not born to serve, but to stand. Faith, he told them, is not about kneeling, it's about knowing when to rise. He encouraged literacy, critical thought, and self-reliance. He wore Western clothes, spoke English fluently, and used the tools of the empire to challenge the empire itself. To British officials, he was a curiosity, a native too educated for his own good. But to the people, he was a prophet in human form. The more he taught, the more the British watched. They saw in his sermons something more dangerous than rebellion awakening. Chilembwe's pulpit became a podium for justice. His church walls echoed with ideas that could not be contained. And somewhere deep within his heart, he began to see what faith demanded of him next, not another sermon, but a stand. Because in a world built on submission, even a prayer could sound like defiance. When the Great War erupted in Europe in 1914, its thunder reached even the quiet hills of Nyasaland. The British Empire demanded men, money, and obedience from every corner of its dominions. In Africa, that meant blood and labor. The colonial government conscripted thousands of African men to serve as porters and soldiers for a war they neither understood nor benefited from. They were marched for miles, barefoot, carrying guns, ammunition, and supplies for white officers who barely knew their names. Many never returned. Disease and exhaustion killed more than bullets. Back home, the plantations did not rest. The British landowners grew richer as the people starved. Villages were raided for recruits. Women were forced to grind grain for the army. Children watched their fathers taken away under the pretext of duty to the crown. The empire called it service. The people called it slavery reborn. John Chilembwe saw all of it. From his pulpit at Providence Church, he witnessed young men whipped for refusing to fight a white man's war. He saw the mutilated body of a worker hung from a tree by the notorious estate owner, William Jervis Livingstone, as a warning to the others. It was not law, it was terror disguised as order. Each lash of the whip struck deeper into Chilembwe's faith. He prayed for guidance, but the answers came not in words, but in wounds. He began to understand what his mentors in America had meant when they said, freedom must sometimes be claimed, not granted. And so, quietly, he began to plan. Not for vengeance, but for dignity. He gathered a few trusted followers, teachers, carpenters, and farmers who shared his vision of a life without chains. They met in the shadows of his church, whispering beneath the hymn of the night wind. Chilembwe still wore his clerical collar, still carried his Bible, but now, the words inside it felt heavier. In the book of Exodus, Moses had led his people out of bondage. In Nyasaland, Chilembwe would try to do the same. Faith alone was no longer enough. The time had come for action sanctified by conscience. January 1915. The rains had come to Nyasaland, washing the red dust into rivers of clay. The world seemed quiet, but beneath the surface, a revolution was breathing. Chilembwe gathered his disciples inside the dimly lit chapel of the Providence Industrial Mission. Candles flickered against the wooden walls as he spoke, his voice low but unwavering. "We will not kill for revenge," he said, "but so that our children may live as men." The plan was daring, perhaps impossible. They would strike at the heart of colonial brutality, the Bruce estates, owned by Livingstone, the man whose cruelty had become legend. On the night of January 23rd, small groups of farmers and workers armed themselves with stolen rifles, machetes, and old hunting guns. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. Inside the church they prayed one last time. Chilembwe opened his Bible to the book of Judges and read aloud, "Rise, for the Lord has delivered them into your hands." When the bell struck midnight, they moved. Through fields of wet sugar cane and along the narrow paths, the rebels advanced toward the estate. The guards were unprepared. Shots echoed across the valley. By dawn, William Jervis Livingstone, the master who had hung black men like trophies, was dead. For the first time in history, the blood of the oppressor, not the oppressed, stained Nyasaland's soil. But Chilembwe did not celebrate. He walked into his church at sunrise and ordered a black flag to be raised above it. Across the dark cloth were written words that would echo for generations. "The African has the right to live, to believe, and to die in freedom." For a brief, trembling moment, the colony itself seemed to hold its breath. The news spread like wildfire through the plantations and towns. Men whispered the name Chilembwe with awe. Women wept in disbelief. Somewhere in the empire's machinery, a single cog had dared to jam itself against the wheel. It was not a war of armies. It was a war of meaning. And on that humid night, the empire learned that faith can burn hotter than fire. By dawn, the hills of Blantyre trembled with the weight of rumor and gunfire. The impossible had happened. A group of African men had struck down a British estate owner. In a land where even raising one's voice could bring the whip, it was an earthquake of the soul. John Chilembwe did not flee. He stood before his congregation that morning, his white collar still immaculate, and preached as he always did. But this time, every word carried the sound of defiance. "My brothers," he said, "we have been taught to bow our heads. Today, we lift them. We do not kill for hatred, we rise for justice." He knew what would come next. The British Empire would not ignore a black pastor who dared to challenge its order. But for one fleeting day, his church became the beating heart of African pride. The black flag fluttered above Providence Mission, its words visible even from the distant hills. "The African has the right to live, to believe, and to die in freedom." Farmers left their fields, workers abandoned the plantations. All across southern Nyasaland, whispers turned into shouts. To some, Chilembwe was a prophet. To others, a fool walking into martyrdom. But even those who feared his end could not deny his courage. The empire had taken everything from these people: land, labor, even the right to pray without permission. But in that single night, Chilembwe gave them something greater than land or wages. He gave them the memory of resistance. He refused to hide behind sermons. Instead, he wrote to the colonial government, declaring the rebellion's purpose: "We do not seek to destroy life, but to demand that the life of the African be respected." As the sun fell that evening, Chilembwe watched the horizon from the church steps. The British troops had not yet arrived, but he could already hear the distant hum of their approach, the metallic sound of chains returning to claim their order. Still, he did not run. He prayed softly, not for victory, but for courage. Because freedom, he knew, often begins with a man who dares to stay still while the world demands he kneel. When news of the uprising reached Zomba, the colonial capital, panic spread among the British administrators. They could not believe that a pastor, educated, civilized, baptized in their own faith, had dared to lead a revolt. Their pride was wounded, and pride, in empires, always bleeds into vengeance. Within hours, armed troops were dispatched from Zomba and Mangochi. Machine guns, bayonets, and soldiers marched through the villages, crushing any sign of rebellion. The empire that had once claimed to bring peace now unleashed fire. Villages were burned. Men suspected of aiding Chilembwe were shot in the streets. Women were interrogated, beaten, and left among the ashes of their homes. The air smelled of gunpowder and grief. The British called it restoring order. The people called it retribution. Chilembwe fled with a small group of loyal followers into the thick forests near Mulanje. He carried with him a single book, his Bible, and a letter addressed to the colonial government. In it, he wrote, "When men and women can no longer find justice, they will search for it in blood and tears." The soldiers hunted him for days, moving through the jungle like predators. Every captured rebel was executed, every sympathizer punished. But even as the rebellion was torn apart, its spirit refused to die. In Blantyre, the black flag was torn down and trampled. Yet the British officers found themselves unsettled. Among the burned ruins of the church, they discovered verses scrawled across the wall, Chilembwe's handwriting. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." He had not written it for the victors. He had written it for the next generation. In the forest, Chilembwe's followers urged him to escape to Mozambique, to start anew. But the pastor's eyes, weary yet calm, reflected something deeper than fear. "We have sown the seed," he said. "Even if they kill us, it will grow where they cannot see." The empire thought it was crushing a rebellion. It was, unknowingly, watering a revolution. By early February 1915, the rebellion had been smothered in blood. The fields, once heavy with sugarcane, now lay silent, blackened by gunfire and smoke. Soldiers combed the hills, dogs sniffing the earth for scent of fugitives. The British had made a vow: no mercy until the cross itself bled. John Chilembwe and a handful of followers hid in the dense forests near Mlanje. For days, they lived on rainwater and scraps of food, praying under the sound of distant gunshots. The jungle, once their sanctuary, began to feel like a tomb. Chilembwe knew his days were numbered. Yet there was no fear in him, only a quiet resignation that his mission had already crossed the border of mortality. He wrote one last sermon, folded neatly inside his Bible. "I die for the salvation of my people. If I must fall, let my blood water the tree of their freedom." On February 3rd, 1915, as dawn broke pale over the forest, Chilembwe tried to cross the border into Mozambique. A British patrol spotted him near a small riverbank. There was no trial, no negotiation. A shot rang out, echoing through the trees. He fell face first into the mud, his Bible still clutched against his chest. The pages opened to the Gospel of John. "Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." The soldiers dragged his body back to Blantyre. His head was severed and hung in front of his church, the very place where he had once preached forgiveness. To the British, it was a warning. To his people, it was a revelation. Crowds gathered in silence before the church ruins, their eyes fixed on the lifeless face that once spoke of hope. Even those who had doubted him now wept openly. For the first time, they saw not a man defeated, but a martyr, a preacher who had dared to challenge the heavens of empire. The authorities believed they had restored order, but they had, in truth, created a ghost that would walk beside every African heart that still dreamed of freedom. In killing John Chilembwe, the British silenced a voice. But they could not silence the question he left behind. How long will men kneel before injustice and call it peace? After Chilembwe's death, the rebellion faded into whispers. The British executed dozens of his followers, imprisoned hundreds more, and buried the rest in unmarked graves. To the empire, it was the end of an inconvenience. To the people of Nyasaland, it was the beginning of memory. In the villages, old women told children of the pastor who stood against guns with only a Bible in his hand. Songs began to spread quiet hymns in the night, sung in secret so the soldiers would not hear. The lyrics carried no hatred, only remembrance. He spoke, and the earth trembled. The colonial government tried to erase him. His church was demolished, his writings banned, and his name forbidden from public speech. But faith has its own way of keeping the dead alive. In 1917, a missionary in Blantyre found a small, hand-carved cross left at the ruins of Providence Mission. On it, etched faintly, were the words, "God walks with the ones who do not bow." It was unsigned, perhaps carved by one of Chilembwe's students, or maybe by a grieving villager who had once heard him preach. As years passed, his story crossed borders. Activists from Zimbabwe, Kenya, and South Africa spoke his name in underground meetings. They called him the African Moses. His image calm, eyes lifted, wearing his clerical collar became a symbol of what the empire feared most, the union of faith and defiance. Even British newspapers began to speak uneasily of him. Some called him dangerous, others admirable, but all agreed. His uprising had shattered the illusion of eternal peace in the colonies. Decades later, when African independence movements swept across the continent, they carried Chilembwe's fire. His words, "God did not create slaves," became a prayer and a prophecy. In every struggle that followed, from Ghana to Kenya to South Africa, his spirit marched unseen beside those who refused to kneel. He had died without an army, but his faith had outlived every bullet that tried to silence it. By the time the British Empire began to crumble after World War II, his name had grown from a forbidden whisper into a banner of remembrance. John Chilembwe was no longer the pastor of one small mission. He had become the conscience of a continent. Nearly 50 years passed before the dream John Chilembwe died for began to bloom. The British Empire, once mighty and unshakable, had begun to crack under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Across Africa, colonies were shedding their chains, one flag at a time. In 1964, Nyasaland at last broke free and took a new name, Malawi. The Union Jack was lowered, and in its place rose the red, black, and green of a nation born from suffering. Crowds filled the streets of Blantyre and Lilongwe, dancing barefoot on the very soil once stained with blood. But amid the joy, one name echoed louder than any anthem: John Chilembwe. The new government declared him a national hero, the father of Malawian independence. Statues were raised in his honor, though none could truly capture his quiet defiance. One stood in Lilongwe Chilembwe's bronze face, serene, eyes gazing westward toward the lands that had once enslaved his people. His hands held a Bible, not as a symbol of submission, but as a weapon of truth. Each year, on January 15th, the nation stops to remember. The day is known as Chilembwe Day. Church bells ring from dawn until dusk. Children in schools recite his words, "God did not create slaves." Families visit the site of his mission, rebuilt from its ashes, and leave flowers where the black flag once waved. Older generations still tell stories of that night in 1915 when the world turned upside down. They speak of how a pastor's sermon became a battle cry, and how one act of courage cracked open the door to freedom. And though independence came long after his death, the spirit of Chilembwe's stand became the spine of a nation's identity. Malawi was not born through conquest or decree, it was born through conviction. In the capital, when the morning sun strikes the statue's face, the bronze gleams like fire. People say it looks as if the pastor is still watching, still reminding them that freedom, once gained, must never again be taken for granted. For every child born in Malawi, his name is more than history, it is a prayer whispered in the heart. We are free because he dared to believe we could be. John Chilembwe was not a soldier, yet he fought a war greater than any fought with guns. His rebellion was not of steel or blood alone, it was of belief. In a world built on submission, he dared to redefine what it meant to serve God. He understood that prayer without justice is emptiness, that peace without dignity is bondage. He saw that a cross can be both a symbol of salvation and of silence, and he refused the latter. Chilembwe's life reminds us that revolutions are not always born in battlefields. Sometimes they are born in chapels, in whispered prayers, in the quiet decision to say no when the world demands you bow. He died without seeing freedom, yet he created the language of it. His blood, spilled on colonial soil, became ink for the story of a continent's awakening. And though his church was torn down, its walls still stand not in wood or stone, but in the courage of those who remember. Today, when the bells toll each January 15th, they do not mourn him, they summon his spirit. In the rustle of flags, in the echo of hymns, in the silence before dawn, his words still live. Freedom is sacred, because it is the moment when man becomes most like God. And in those moments, across Malawi, one can almost imagine him standing again in his small chapel, light pouring through the broken windows, Bible in hand, eyes unafraid. He does not speak of vengeance. He does not ask for pity. He simply reminds us that faith, when married to courage, can ignite an empire's end. In every era, every struggle, his question remains: will we bow and pray for mercy, or will we stand and pray for strength? The answer, whispered through generations, is the same one he gave with his life. Stand.